Welcome to Charmed, I'm Sure, the cozy, curious podcast where we uncover the hidden magic in everyday life. I'm Jen, and each episode we get charmed by a delightful topic that brings a little enchantment into everyday life. March has arrived, and with it comes a hint of Irish charm. This month, in honor of St. Patrick's Day, we're celebrating luck, lore, and enchanting curiosities that have fascinated people across time and place. Imagine stepping into a kitchen on St. Patrick's Day. A pot of potatoes is steaming on the stove, cabbage is sizzling in butter, and a loaf of soda bread is cooling on the counter. Somewhere nearby, someone is pouring a cold, dark pint of stout. These foods appear every March so naturally that most of us never stop to ask why, but each one carries its own story. Today, we're being charmed by the foods of St. Patrick's Day and the folklore, history, and seasonal traditions that help turn humble ingredients into the dishes we now associate with the holiday. Many of these foods began as practical choices. They grew well in Ireland's climate, they lasted through long winters, and they appeared just as the first signs of spring began returning to the landscape. Let's begin with the ingredient most closely tied to Irish cooking. If there's one food that people immediately associate with Ireland, it's the potato. Potatoes arrived in Ireland in the late 1500s after being brought to Europe from the Americas. Farmers soon realized the crop thrived in Ireland's cool, damp soil. Even better, potatoes produced a large amount of food from a very small plot of land. For rural families working modest farms, that efficiency mattered. By the 18th and early 19th centuries, potatoes had become a cornerstone of everyday meals across much of Ireland. One traditional dish that still appears on many Irish tables, especially around celebrations like St. Patrick's Day, is called Colcannon. Colcannon is a comforting dish made from mashed potatoes mixed with cabbage or kale, butter, and scallions. But like many traditional foods, Colcannon gathered its own folklore over time. In older Irish folk traditions, particularly around Halloween, small objects were sometimes hidden inside the dish as a playful way of predicting the future. A coin suggested prosperity, a ring hinted at marriage, and a thimble, the small metal cap used in sewing, meant a life of independence, often interpreted as remaining unmarried. In some Irish traditions, unmarried girls even placed a spoonful of Colcannon under their pillow on Halloween night, hoping they might dream of the person they would eventually marry. So the humble potato occasionally doubled as a small fortune-telling ritual. And potatoes were rarely served alone. In many Irish kitchens, they were paired with another vegetable that grows just as comfortably in the Irish climate. That vegetable was cabbage. Cabbage thrives in cool weather and stores well through the winter months. By early March, fresh heads of cabbage begin appearing in markets and gardens. That timing is meaningful. St. Patrick's Day arrives just before the spring equinox, the moment when daylight begins overtaking darkness. Across Ireland, the landscape slowly shifts from winter gray to the first patches of green. Cabbage was one of the vegetables that helped mark that seasonal turning point. In older European food traditions, the first fresh greens of the year were sometimes described as the taste of spring returning. After months of preserved foods and root vegetables, the first fresh harvest felt like a small celebration. Cooked simply with butter or folded into dishes like Colcannon, It bridged the seasons, sturdy enough for winter and fresh enough to welcome spring. But if you attend a St. Patrick's Day dinner in the United States, there's usually something else on the plate alongside it. And that dish actually tells a story about immigration. Corned beef is now one of the most recognizable St. Patrick's Day foods in the United States. But historically, most families in Ireland didn't eat it regularly. Beef cattle were valuable animals used for dairy and labor, making the meat expensive for many households. Pork, especially Irish bacon, appeared more often on traditional menus. Corned beef became linked to St. Patrick's Day through Irish immigrants living in American cities during the 19th century. In neighborhoods like New York's Lower East Side, Irish immigrants lived near Jewish communities where delicatessens sold salt-cured brisket, what we now know today as corned beef. It was flavorful, affordable, and easy to cook in large portions. Over time, Irish families adopted the dish for celebratory meals. And eventually, corned beef and cabbage became a signature St. Patrick's Day dinner in the United States. And of course, no holiday meal feels complete without something fresh from the oven. One of the simplest breads associated with Ireland is soda bread. It developed in the 19th century when baking soda became widely available. Instead of waiting hours for yeast to rise, bakers could combine flour, salt, baking soda, and buttermilk and place the dough directly into the oven. The cross cut into the top of the loaf had a practical purpose. It allowed heat to reach the center so the bread baked evenly. But folklore added another layer of meaning. In Irish tradition, people often made small gestures to protect the home from mischievous spirits, sometimes called the good people, beings connected to the fairy world of Irish folklore. Some stories said the cross in the bread helped let the fairies out, so they wouldn't interfere with the baking. Others believed the mark acted as a blessing over the loaf, protecting the household. Whether taken literally or simply as a charming tradition, the cross became part of the baking ritual. Today, you'll often see soda bread made with additions like raisins, currants, or caraway seeds, especially in Irish American versions of the recipe. These give the loaf a slightly sweeter flavor. And of course, St. Patrick's Day celebrations usually include one more famous Irish tradition. St. Patrick's Day is closely tied to Irish beer. Brewing has deep roots in Ireland, but the drink most closely associated with the holiday today is stout, particularly dark stouts like Guinness. Guinness began brewing in Dublin in 1759 and eventually became one of Ireland's most recognizable exports. What gives stout its deep color and rich flavor is roasted barley. During brewing, the barley is roasted at high temperatures, creating the dark color and the slightly bittersweet flavors people often describe as coffee-like or chocolatey. A traditional pint of Guinness is poured in 2 stages. First, filling most of the glass, then allowing the beer to settle before topping it off. The process helps create the creamy foam the drink is famous for. And on St. Patrick's Day, some bartenders even draw a small shamrock in the foam as a festive touch. Irish pubs themselves have long been gathering places for music, storytelling, and conversation, which makes sharing a pint feel less like a drink and more like a small social ritual. When you look at these foods together, a pattern appears. Most began as practical ingredients: potatoes that could feed a household, cabbage that survived the winter months, and bread made from a handful of simple staples. But over time, those everyday foods gathered stories, traditions, and celebrations. and each March they return to the table, carrying a little history along with them. Thanks for getting charmed by St. Patrick's Day foods and traditions with me today. Whether it's a warm loaf of bread, a simple potato dish, or a shared meal with friends, may this week bring a few small moments of good fortune your way. If you enjoyed this episode, follow the show to keep discovering a little charm, wonder, and inspiration each week. And now it's time for Practical Magic, a tip from today's episode that you can bring into your own life. Food traditions often survive because they add a small moment of delight to an ordinary meal. So this week, try creating your own tiny St. Patrick's Day tradition. It could be something simple, like a chocolate coin tucked beside someone's plate, or a handwritten good luck note inside a napkin, or even serving a dish that features the first green vegetables of the season. Traditions usually start small, and sometimes the most memorable moments at a table come from the smallest surprises. Thanks for listening to Charmed, I'm Sure. And until next time, may every day bring a little charm your way.